Hi everybody. As we move along into the next part of our project and exercises that we are working on, I want to talk a little bit about a grid. And a grid is a tool that designers use, and even if they are thinking about time-based design, they use a grid, or they can benefit from a grid, whether we think about it that way or not. So I want to highlight a few things, give you some foundational components, and if you build into other tools or resources or courses in the program as a designer or even as a multimedia individual, you will be thinking about grids and considering them. So I want to highlight a few things as we go along. One of the things that we've looked at is this idea of principles of design. And principles of design, we've looked before, we've heard of BURPM, that's another way of describing these, but just kind of breaking it down just in a 4-step way is contrast, repetition, proximity, and alignment, and how we make elements different, how we repeat components, and how we put things that are related closer together, and we share common edges. Those are things to consider as a designer and as someone who's using space. As we actually think about a grid, we have just this start, this blank page, this blank surface to work in, whatever format it is. And as soon as we add something, even if it's in the middle, we start to break it down into the composition. We could think about how it is things are placed. We think about where they are placed matters. And if we move it in a corner, if we move it and rotate it, there's lots of little things that we can do to divide that page up. And so it can be something where there's white space and text or image, all little things that we need to pay attention to as we are working. Okay, so the grid, how do we divide up the page? When we think about a grid, it's used for organization. How do we help communicate the information that we need to communicate in a way that this is what you should see first, second, and third, kind of going on in that hierarchy. Thinking about how do we work between page 1 to page 3 to page 17 to page 46. How do we work and create unity that way? And how do we do from, maybe if it's like something like a magazine, how do we go from the current issue to the next issue to the next issue? Or a book, how do we create a series? So thinking about using a grid to build unity can be helpful, and it can also help make control or maintain control. We always know where the page number goes, those kinds of little things. Okay, so why we use them, it's important. It's a helpful tool. And it divides or defines the space on what is active and what is not active, what is negative. We share that idea of alignment. We share that idea of proximity. We share that idea of contrast and repetition as well. But it's a series in a real basic format. It is a series of intersecting horizontal and vertical lines. And there's different ways that we can look at it, but how do we divide space on a page? The most common way that we do this is just by using margins. You've done it before when you've written papers, but we just have one column of text. And then we have top, right, bottom, and left, just thinking clockwise on both sides of the page. Or if we think about it as a spread, inside, outside, top, and bottom. So this really basic grid that we consider, just one column, there's space around, there's space between, and things exist in a consistent location. Another way that we can think about it from one column or single column layout is multiple column layout. This gives us a little more structure. It gives us a little more flexibility. Okay? Even if we think way back when, the way that things were printed made it easier to understand the information, use the space more, get more content, actually overall saved pages because it would push content together. We could get more words per page, for example. Or we could do something where it was different languages. One column is one language, another column is a different language, etc. Okay, so remembering just like that, a grid is a guide. A grid is a guide. It's the structure made up of horizontals and verticals. It divides a page in forehand into columns and margins. There's all little things that we can think about as we get into more detail. The more columns that we have, the more flexibility we have. So on the left, you see one with 2 columns, the one on the right with 3 columns. Just a way to give a little more flexibility in terms of images, in terms of text, etc. Some of the basic components of a grid: we have margins, we have text columns, we have space between columns, we have a hang line or a flow line in this instance, what things hang from, and where we read and how we read. We start in the upper left and read down to the bottom right. So where things should be aligned or be paying attention to placement is in the upper left. Then we have some flexibility with the bottom right corner. It doesn't always need to be exactly the same. A background version of this is also using what's called a baseline grid, which is based on your leading, and you'll get into that more, but that's what all those horizontal lines are. And that just allows for more consistency in terms of alignment of things. Okay. So as you're considering a grid, sometimes more columns can be beneficial. Sometimes giving it a little variety helps. But the odd number is actually what's a little bit easier. So 3, 5, 7, 9. What that allows is it gives us a little more space on the outside, for example. Okay. So just some thinking about that. Things can go across more than one column. These you see that some are 2 columns wide, but the image is 1 column wide. On the right, you have 3 columns of text and 2 columns of text and a 5 column grid for the image. So just that structure really helps you work quietly in the background and create consistency. A different way of looking at that. So there's single column, there's multi-column. There's actually something called the modular grid. And the modular grid is basically combining the horizontal and the vertical components. It's like you see here. And that gives us even more flexibility because of alignment top to bottom and alignment left to right. Gives you a little more variety. That's it. A little more complex to think about, but it can help. Something to consider. And you might see this if you think in a photograph of a 3x3 photograph. That is basically a modular grid. They don't have space between rows and columns, but that doesn't matter. Just thinking about, well, how do I use the right third or the left third or the top third or the bottom third or 2/3, whatever combination of those, okay? So before you can actually build a grid, you must think about what kind of text and images are going to be needed and used and how many. Thinking about what your hierarchy is, thinking about what should they see first, second, and third, thinking about how do text and images work together and how do we read them. And sometimes you've read things before where the description of the photograph is kind of distracting when you're reading the actual text. So comparing or paying attention to proximity and space within those things. Knowing the actual binding method is helpful too, because depending on how your page lays, your spread lays, might be that we need to give more of an inside grid or inside space, inside margin to build with that a little bit. So that's why knowing your format is helpful. So as you're creating a grid, thinking about, or using a grid, I should say, know what your output is. And there's this idea with using the modular grid of similar things that we've already talked about. We group things that are related. We pay attention to the negative space, positive space versus negative space. You don't necessarily want to put things just in the corners, right? So bring them in. That's why that interior margin can be helpful. Thinking about something that where they share an edge. And that doesn't need to be just in the upper left corner. Can we share on the right? Can we share on the left, inside, outside, that kind of thing. And then perhaps using the rule of thirds as just a basic modular grid. How do I take the text as just the first column, and then the right 2 columns in a 3x3 grid would be where you put the image. So it can really unify your pages. It can make it just comfortable to look at. It can make it have consistency, give it a little bit of interest, like I said. So think about how you might use a grid in where you are right now. Consider that and share edges with things. Think about creating that contrast, creating that hierarchy, creating that repetition, using repetition and rhythm, and putting things close together that are related. So that model of contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Consider those as you're using this as you go to the next part.